The morning began like countless others for Captain Sarah. The terminal was alive with the usual chaos, families hurrying with strollers, business travelers tapping away at laptops, voices rising and falling in 1,000 directions. To most, it was noise, but to Sarah it was routine. She moved through the crowd with a calm grace, suitcase in hand, uniform crisp, the kind of poise that seemed unshakable no matter what the day brought. To her passengers, she was just another face behind the cockpit door, but to her crew, Sarah was something more. They admired her steady composure, the way she carried herself with authority without arrogance. She never barked commands, never raised her voice, yet no one ever questioned who was in charge. Her co-pilot, a younger officer named, often marveled at her ability to make decisions with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. "You've got nerves of steel, Captain," joked once as they prepped for a flight through heavy turbulence. Sarah only smiled. "Steel bends if it has to," she replied. It was a strange answer, but it fit her. What no one knew, not the passengers boarding Flight 287 that afternoon, not the airline executives who praised her spotless record, not even the crew who worked beside her week after week, was that Sarah's steel had been forged in fire long before she ever touched a commercial jet. But that was a life she had buried deep. She checked her instruments carefully as the 737 waited on the runway. 179 passengers sat behind her, trusting her without even realizing it. The trust of strangers was part of the job, but Sarah never took it lightly. Every takeoff, every landing carried the weight of lives in her hands. And while most pilots viewed it as a professional responsibility, for Sarah, it was personal, because she knew how quickly a sky could turn from calm to chaos. Her crew moved efficiently through their final checks. The flight attendants closed overhead bins and offered reassuring smiles, called out numbers, reading them off with practiced rhythm. Everything was routine, everything was normal, and yet Sarah felt it. A flicker of instinct stirred in her chest, a quiet unease that she could neither name nor dismiss. It wasn't fear. Sarah didn't fear the sky. It was something else, like the way seasoned sailors sense a storm before the horizon darkens. She shook it off. Years of flying had taught her to trust procedure, not feelings. Still, the whisper lingered. As the jet roared down the runway and lifted into the air, Sarah's hands gripped the yoke with practiced precision. The engines thundered, the cabin rattled, but her heartbeat never quickened. To the passengers, it was a simple climb into the clouds. To Sarah, it was entry into her second home. The sky had always felt like hers. At 35,000 feet, Flight 287 leveled into cruising altitude. The cabin lights dimmed, the sign clicked off, and a wave of calm settled across the passengers. A mother pulled a blanket over her sleeping child. A businessman opened his laptop. Flight attendants moved gracefully with carts of drinks and smiles. To anyone watching, it was the picture of peace. And Sarah was the picture of control. But beneath that polished surface lived a truth the world had forgotten. Her instincts were sharper than most, her reactions faster, her awareness deeper. Even in moments of stillness, her eyes scanned the instruments. Her ears picked up subtle engine tones, her mind calculated contingencies. She didn't just fly planes. She read them, felt them, anticipated them as though they were extensions of herself. Leaned back in his seat and stretched, unaware of the quiet intensity in the captain beside him. "Smooth ride today," he said casually. Sarah glanced out the window at the endless expanse of blue. Smooth, yes, for now. But she couldn't ignore that flicker of unease. Something was coming. She didn't know what, she didn't know when, but her gut told her this flight would not be as ordinary as the world believed. Flight 287 carried 179 souls, and all of them trusted her without question. Sarah never betrayed trust. Not then, not now, not ever. The storm, however, was already waiting for her. For an hour, Flight 287 glided smoothly through the sky, a silver arrow against the canvas of blue. The passengers settled into their routines, some reading, some napping, some tapping away at phones and laptops. The cabin hummed with the low, comforting white noise of flight, the kind of sound that lulled people into forgetting how fragile an aircraft truly was. Inside the cockpit, Sarah remained vigilant. Her eyes flicked between dials, screens, and the horizon. Everything appeared normal, but her instincts whispered otherwise. It was the same quiet unease she had felt on the runway, now pulsing stronger, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Broke the silence. Autopilot engaged. We've got clear skies ahead. Sarah didn't reply right away. She was listening, not just to him, but to the rhythm of the engines, the faint vibrations through the yoke, the subtle pitch of the cabin. Years of experience had trained her to detect the slightest anomaly, and now there it was, a tremor, small but undeniable, running through the left engine. Her brow furrowed. "Do you feel that?" Glanced at the gauges. "Everything looks green to me." But Sarah wasn't satisfied. She leaned in, scanning the instruments more closely. Numbers held steady, yet the tremor continued, like a heartbeat gone irregular. Her gut tightened. Something was wrong, and it was only a matter of time before the aircraft revealed its secret. It came without warning. A deafening boom erupted from the left side of the plane. The aircraft shuddered violently, jolting passengers awake with screams. Oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling as the cabin pressure plummeted. Alarms blared, lights flashed red, and chaos broke loose 30,000 feet above the ground. "Engine 1 failure," shouted, his voice cracking. Sarah's hands were already moving, faster than thought. She wrestled the yoke, steadying the plane against a brutal yaw to the left. Warning systems screamed in her ears, but she shut them out, focusing only on the feel of the aircraft beneath her. The bucked and lurched like a wounded beast, and for a moment, gravity threatened to rip them apart. In the cabin, passengers gasped for breath through dangling masks. A child wailed, someone prayed aloud, and flight attendants clung to overhead compartments as the jet dropped hundreds of feet in seconds. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, firm and steady, broadcast across the intercom. "This is your captain. We've had an engine failure. Stay calm. We are in control." The words weren't just reassurance. They were a command to herself. Fear could not exist here. Not for her. Not when 179 lives depended on her calm. His hands shook as he worked the emergency checklist. "Altitude loss severe. What do we do, Captain?" "Follow my lead," Sarah replied. Her voice was steel. Her mind ran calculations at lightning speed: weight, drag, thrust, glide ratio. Training buried deep in her past resurfaced like a reflex. She angled the wings, countering the violent spin, guiding the crippled jet back into a fragile balance. For a terrifying stretch of seconds, the plane teetered between recovery and free fall. The passengers screamed again as turbulence threw drinks, bags, and bodies into the air. But slowly, inch by inch, breath by breath, Sarah wrestled the wounded aircraft under control. The alarms quieted, the descent steadied. The jet flew again, though crippled and fragile, like a bird missing a wing. Inside the cockpit, exhaled in disbelief. "I thought we were finished." Sarah's eyes stayed locked on the horizon, hands steady on the controls. "We're not finished until we're on the ground." For her, the danger wasn't over. She knew one engine down meant compromised power, limited maneuverability, and far fewer options if anything else went wrong. And with the cabin pressure unstable and a storm brewing miles ahead, the flight was far from safe. Behind the cockpit door, 179 people clung to their seats, unaware that the woman flying their plane wasn't just reacting. She was reaching into a part of herself she had sworn never to use again. The instincts of a fighter pilot, honed in battles the world never knew about, had returned without hesitation. Sarah didn't need reminders of her past. The sky had just forced her to remember. The aircraft limped forward through a turbulent sky, its left engine dead, its right straining against the added burden. Sarah held the yoke steady, every muscle in her arms locked in place, every nerve sharpened by focus. Behind her, the cabin buzzed with panic, passengers whispering frantic prayers, others sobbing into their masks, flight attendants struggling to keep order. The air was thick with fear, but Sarah kept her voice calm, because panic was a contagion she could not allow to spread. "Status?" she asked without turning her head. He was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "We're losing altitude faster than projected. We won't make Denver." Sarah's eyes flicked to the fuel gauge and radar. Denver was the designated diversion airport. Large runways, experienced crews, all the emergency services they would need. But was right. At their current descent rate, the plane wouldn't last that far. "What's closer?" she pressed. Scan the display, his voice trembling. "Closest is Franklin Regional, but Captain, it's not built for heavy jets. The runway's too short and—" "We don't have a choice," Sarah cut in, her tone final. "Plot a course, alert the tower." He hesitated, then nodded, tapping into the radio. As the storm ahead grew darker, the cockpit lights reflected in Sarah's eyes, calm but unyielding. She could feel the fear clawing at her co-pilot, at the passengers, even at the flight attendants who trusted her. But she would not let it touch her. Fear was an indulgence, and indulgence had no place in survival. "Ladies and," her voice echoed through the cabin, smooth and controlled. "We will be making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew. You are safe. We are in control." Safe, in control. She gave them those words because words could anchor people, even when the world was tilting beneath them. The approach was brutal. Rain lashed against the windshield, streaking the glass in sheets. Wind shoved at the aircraft like invisible hands, and turbulence jolted the passengers until screams filled the cabin again. The runway at Franklin was barely visible, a narrow strip of asphalt swallowed by storm and darkness. His voice shook. "It's too short, we'll never stop in time." Sarah didn't flinch. "Then we stop anyway." She adjusted the flaps, coaxing every ounce of lift from the battered wings. Her hands worked with the precision of a surgeon, balancing power, angle, and descent. Warnings screamed at her, altitude too low, speed too high, but she ignored them. Machines didn't know miracles. Pilots did. As the runway loomed, passengers braced, some holding hands, others closing their eyes to block out the final moments. In the galley, a flight attendant whispered, "Please let her do it." The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-rattling screech. Sparks flared as metal kissed asphalt, and the entire aircraft shuddered violently. The cabin erupted in screams as bags crashed from overhead bins. Sarah's hands gripped the yoke, her feet slammed the brakes, every nerve in her body focused on keeping the jet centered on the impossibly narrow strip. The end of the runway raced toward them. "Come on," Sarah whispered, as if speaking directly to the machine. "Stop for me, stop." The aircraft skidded, hydroplaning across the slick surface, tires shrieking against the rain-soaked ground. For a heartbeat, it seemed inevitable. They would overshoot, crash into the field beyond, and all 179 lives would end. Then, with a final groan of metal and rubber, the plane shuddered to a halt. Silence swallowed the cabin. For a moment, no one moved. Then a baby cried, followed by gasps of relief, and finally a wave of applause that erupted like thunder. Passengers sobbed, clutched each other, and thanked God aloud. Sarah leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Her hands, steady until now, trembled just once before she steadied them again. She reached for the intercom. "Ladies and," she said softly, her voice calm as ever, "welcome to safety." The crew burst into tears of relief, sat back staring at her in awe, whispering, "That was impossible." Sarah gave no answer. She simply looked out at the storm still raging beyond the runway, her expression unreadable. She had done the impossible. She had saved every life on that aircraft. But deep down, she knew something else. The skis hadn't finished with her yet. For days after the landing, Sarah's name filled headlines across the nation. News anchors replayed shaky footage of passengers cheering inside the cabin, their voices hoarse with gratitude. Articles called her the miracle pilot, the woman who beat the storm, and the captain who saved 179 lives. Her picture appeared everywhere. In uniform, smiling politely, her eyes calm and unshaken. She answered interviews sparingly, always with the same line, "I did my job, that's all." But not everyone believed it was just a job. On the third day after the landing, Sarah reported for a routine check flight. Airline policy required senior captains to test new equipment after an emergency, and Sarah welcomed the distraction. She preferred the cockpit to microphones, the skis to crowded newsrooms. Up there, she could breathe again. As they lifted into the air, her co-pilot noticed her distraction. "You all right, Captain? You've been quiet all morning." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the contrails in the distance, thin white scars drawn across the blue. At first, they seemed ordinary, but then her sharp eyes caught movement. Two aircraft, sleek and dark, gliding high above in perfect formation. They weren't commercial, they weren't cargo. They were fighters. Her chest tightened. She knew the silhouette instantly. F-22 Raptors, the Air Force's pride, jets that few civilians ever saw up close. But Sarah had seen them before. She had flown near them, sparred against them in training runs, studied their maneuvers until they became second nature. "What are they doing here?" muttered, noticing them now. "We're not near a base." Sarah said nothing. The fighters weren't attacking, weren't intercepting. They were circling, like wolves keeping a watchful distance from a lone traveler. By the time they landed, the Raptors had vanished, but Sarah's unease remained. That evening, as she walked to her car in the employee parking lot, two men in dark suits stood waiting. Their posture was rigid, their expressions unreadable. They weren't journalists. "Captain?" one asked, flashing credentials so quickly she barely caught the emblem of the Department of Defense. "We'd like a word." Sarah froze, her instincts bristling. She had hoped this day would never come. The taller man spoke first. "That landing you performed, it was extraordinary." "Just training and experience," Sarah said carefully. The man's lips curved into something between a smile and a smirk. "Training, yes, but not the kind commercial airlines provide." Sarah's stomach turned. They knew. The other man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You weren't supposed to fly again, not after what happened." For a split second, Sarah's mask slipped. Memories surged. The roar of engines, the flash of tracers in night skis, the coded of squadrons only a handful of people knew. The classified mission that had gone wrong. The guilt she had buried. Her jaw tightened. "That part of my life is over." "Is it?" the taller one asked. His eyes flicked toward the sky. "Those Raptors you saw weren't random patrols. They were there for you, to remind us that you're not forgotten, and to remind you that legends don't simply fade." Sarah stared at him, silent. 1,000 responses pressed at her tongue, but none escaped. The men exchanged glances, then stepped back. "We'll be in touch." She drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The city lights blurred around her, but her mind was elsewhere, back in the desert training ranges, in cockpits that rattled with speed, in the adrenaline-soaked calm of combat skis. The world saw her as a hero, a pilot who pulled off a miracle, but the Air Force saw her for what she truly was, one of their own, a ghost who had reappeared. And ghosts, once seen, were never left alone. Sarah had tried to bury her past, but now the shadows in the sky were digging it up again. Sarah sat in her quiet apartment, blinds drawn, lights low. The world outside celebrated her as a hero, but she wanted none of it. She had declined more interviews, ignored phone calls, and shut out curious colleagues. The last thing she needed was more attention. Attention meant questions, and questions could lead straight to the truth she had worked so hard to bury. She poured herself a glass of water, staring at the condensation as it trickled down the side. Her reflection in the glass looked older, more tired than she remembered. Maybe the landing had aged her, or maybe the memories it stirred had done the real damage. She hadn't thought about that life in years, not since she'd turned her back on it, walking away from call signs, squadrons, and medals. But the visit from those men in suits had shaken her. They hadn't said much, but they didn't need to. She knew what they wanted. They wanted the pilot she used to be. The pilot she had sworn never to become again. Her mind drifted back to the desert. She could still smell the jet fuel, hear the roar of engines splitting the sky. She was 23 again, standing on the tarmac with her helmet tucked under her arm, sunlight reflecting off the visor. Back then she was fearless, or maybe reckless. They had called her Falcon, a name that stuck not because she liked it, but because she had earned it. Swift, sharp, unshakable. She remembered her first solo in the F-16. The surge of power as the afterburners kicked in, the ground disappearing beneath her in seconds, the sky opening wide like it had been waiting just for her. Her instructors said she had instincts you couldn't teach, that she flew like the jet was part of her body. It was intoxicating, addictive, a rush no civilian would ever understand. And then came the missions. Not the training runs or simulated dogfights, the real ones. The kind no one put on recruiting posters, the kind buried in classified files. She had flown into places the maps didn't mark, carried out tasks the news would never report. The world would never know how many disasters were quietly avoided because of pilots like her. But one mission had ended it all. She never said the details aloud, not to her family, not to her friends, not even to herself in the mirror, but she remembered every second. The night sky glowing with tracer fire, the sudden malfunction in her wingman's jet, the impossible decision forced upon her in the span of a heartbeat. She had acted, but not fast enough. She had saved part of her squadron, but not all. The military called it acceptable loss. Sarah called it unbearable. She remembered the silence after, the debriefing rooms filled with cold stares, the medals pinned to her chest that felt like lead weights. The world might have saluted her, but she couldn't salute herself. So she walked away. She traded combat missions for commercial routes, afterburners for autopilot call signs for. It was supposed to be a clean break, a way to fly without the ghost screaming in her ears. And for a while it worked. Passengers smiled, thanked her, and never asked about the scars she carried inside. But the emergency landing had changed everything. She hadn't just saved lives. She had flown like Falcon again. The precision, the instincts, the refusal to let death win, those weren't the skills of a commercial captain. Those were the instincts of a fighter pilot, a warrior of the skis. And the Air Force had noticed. Sarah pressed her hands against her face, forcing back the tears she never allowed herself. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. That chapter was closed. But deep inside, a truth gnawed at her. She had never really left. The Falcon was still there, waiting. And now the world was trying to pull her out of the shadows once more. The phone rang twice before Sarah picked it up, each ring slicing through the quiet apartment like a warning. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the receiver. When she finally answered, the voice on the other end was calm, measured, but carried a weight that made her stomach twist. "Captain," the man said, "we need you back. There's a situation in the Pacific. You're the only one who can respond." She closed her eyes. For months she had tried to ignore the pull of that life, the roar of fighter jets, the adrenaline that made her feel more alive than she had ever felt in civilian skis. She had built a world away from classified missions, away from danger, away from herself. And now that world was cracking at the edges. "What do you mean, need me?" she asked, trying to sound neutral, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "There's been an incursion near American airspace. Intelligence reports indicate potential hostile aircraft. We can't deploy anyone but pilots with your expertise. You're the only one who can execute these maneuvers with that level of precision." Sarah pressed the phone to her temple. She remembered the emergency landing, the way her instincts had taken over without thought. The news articles called her a hero, the Air Force called her a legend, and she called herself a survivor. But this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about choice. Her gaze drifted to the window. The city lights blinked below like a map of the world she had sworn to leave behind. Memories of the past mission, the one she had walked away from, returned unbidden. Her wingman lost in an instant. The guilt, the shame, the feeling that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. She had promised herself she would never go back. Civilian life offered safety. She could continue flying commercial jets, saving lives in a controlled environment, and leave the ghosts in the sky where they belonged. And yet, she couldn't ignore the instinct that had saved 179 lives just weeks ago. The part of her that had refused to let Flight 287 crash, that had guided the crippled aircraft to a miraculous landing. What was that, if not a reminder of who she truly was? Her hand tightened around the receiver. "I can't," she whispered. "Captain," the man replied, voice steady but insistent, "this isn't a request. Your skills are unmatched. Without you, lives will be lost." She sat back, weighing her options. Every fiber of her being wanted to say no, to close the door on the military forever. But her instincts screamed at her. If she didn't act, someone else would pay the price. Someone innocent. For hours, she wrestled with the decision. She thought of the passengers on Flight 287, of the terrified child she had seen clutching his mother's hand. She thought of the precision, the focus, the courage that had always defined her. And she realized something she hadn't admitted even to herself. She was meant for this. Finally, she exhaled. Her voice was calm, controlled. "I'll do it," she said. "But I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm coming as a pilot, nothing else. No one else's mission, no one else's orders, just mine." There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Understood. Prepare for immediate deployment. We'll brief you on everything." She hung up the phone, her heart hammering. The decision was made, yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping into a storm she couldn't control. And maybe she never could. Sarah walked to the window, looking up at the night sky. Somewhere above, unseen, the same F-22s that had circled her weeks ago waited, reminders of the world she had tried to leave behind. She knew the next flight would not be ordinary. It would demand every ounce of skill, every instinct, every lesson she had learned in her life, both civilian and military. And for the first time in years, she felt that old surge of adrenaline, the one that had once made her the Falcon. She was terrified, excited, alive. The choice had been made. The skis were calling, and Sarah would answer. Dawn broke over the airfield, pale light cutting through lingering storm clouds. Sarah stood beside the sleek F-22, its black fuselage gleaming despite the rain. The roar of jets taking off and landing filled the air, a soundtrack she hadn't heard in years, but it was familiar, comforting, alive. She adjusted her helmet, checking her gear with methodical precision. Her co-pilots were younger, brimming with raw talent, but she could see their nerves. She had been there once, and she knew that mixture of fear and exhilaration that came before a mission that mattered. "Ready, Captain?" one of them asked, voice tight. Sarah glanced at the horizon. The Pacific sky stretched before her, gray and unyielding. She took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the jet beneath her. "Let's go," she said simply. The F-22 roared down the runway, powerful engines propelling her into the sky with a force that pressed her back into her seat. As they climbed, she felt the familiar adrenaline, that lightning of clarity that sharpened every sense. She was no longer just a commercial pilot. She was a Falcon, reborn in steel and fire. The mission was precise: intercept unknown aircraft approaching American airspace. Sarah guided her squadron with a mix of strategy and instinct, weaving through clouds and turbulence, reading every movement of their opponents as if she could feel them in the wind. The enemy planes appeared suddenly on radar, sleek and fast, testing the airspace. Her training took over, calculations faster than thought, split-second maneuvers executed with elegance and power. The younger pilots struggled to keep pace, but Sarah's calm command drew them in, directing them through the dance of aerial combat with a grace that left even seasoned officers in awe. Time blurred in the cockpit. Minutes felt like seconds as jets danced and spiraled, the Pacific below a roiling mirror. But Sarah never faltered. Every twist, every climb, every dive was a reflection of decades of skill, commercial and military, past and present fused into one. When the intruders retreated, she guided her squadron back to base, engines humming a softer tune as the danger dissipated. The mission had been successful, lives safeguarded, borders protected, all without a single unnecessary risk. Back on the ground, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, her suit soaked, her face smudged with sweat and grime. The young pilots looked at her with reverence, their awe palpable. They had flown with a legend. She gave them a small nod, humble as always. The news cameras were waiting outside, flashes exploding as reporters shouted questions. Sarah's gaze swept over the crowd, then rested on the first officer from Flight 287 who had come to see her. Memories of the emergency landing flashed vividly. The screaming passengers, the screaming engines, the impossible choice that had saved 179 lives. She smiled faintly, tired but satisfied. "Just doing my job," she said, echoing the same words she had used weeks ago. But this time the words rang differently, not modesty but truth. Her life had come full circle. She had walked away from danger once, buried the Falcon beneath civilian skis, yet when the world demanded her, she had answered. Not for fame, not for medals, but because she could. Because it was who she was. Sarah looked up at the sky again, sunlight breaking through clouds, painting streaks of gold across the tarmac. Somewhere above, the Raptor jets still patrolled, silent guardians in the endless expanse. They had reminded her she could never truly escape her past, but also that she could choose when and how to use it. As passengers and crew cheered her arrival back at the base, she knew that flying, saving lives, was never about glory. It was about control, precision, and courage, about answering the call no matter where it came from. Sarah had begun this journey as just a commercial pilot. She had faced storms, explosions, and impossible choices, and she had emerged as something more, a hero hidden in plain sight, a falcon who refused to fall, and a woman whose legend now spanned both skis, civilian and military, ordinary and extraordinary. And somewhere deep in her chest, the familiar pulse of the sky reminded her, some legends never truly land.